The movie begins with the scene of a man picking up a rough, torn teddy bear and putting it in a bag. That man is scavenging. He picks up a metal bar, puts it in the bag too, and closes the bag. He puts the bag on his shoulder and walks out of the building, passing a body lying on the floor. As he proceeds in the streets, we hear the sounds of explosions, sirens, and gunfire. The man is named Paul. We see the world around him being destroyed and in shambles, and Paul is fleeing from what appears to be the end of civilization. After 15 years, Paul and his twin teenage sons, Joseph and Thomas, live in a remote farmhouse. We see Paul and Joseph at the house, and Thomas is running in the woods and jumping over a cave. Paul waits eagerly outside as Joseph goes in the house and starts covering up the windows and doors. Thomas arrives, Paul complains he is late, and they head inside. They finish boarding up the doors and windows, move to an upper floor and sit at the dinner table. Paul tells Thomas that if he is late again, he will be prohibited from going past the boundaries of the land. He protested that he was helping Mr. Rose at the Rose farm, but Paul's decision is final. The diner continues and the boys start to argue and are separated by their dad. During that night, as the brothers are playing chess, their dog Rocco starts to act up. Thomas and Paul go to the door and there is a loud banging at the door. Thomas and Paul support the door until the banging stops. Thomas is the rash risk-taker type, while Joseph is more of an intellectual. He explains the behavior of whoever was at the door. They attempted it 3 times. The first was a test. The second was the real attempt to break the door. And the third was frustration. The following morning, Paul discovers deep scratches on the door's exterior and finds it infested with bugs. Thomas asks his dad if he can go outside the boundaries, and Paul tells him to finish chopping the wood before going. Joseph gets annoyed at his dad for always letting Thomas do what he wants. Paul goes to the barn where Joseph is working on the ATV. Paul asks Joseph to show him what he has been working on. He wants to improve their situation and is working on the ATV for better transportation, but is unable to make it work. Paul makes some changes and the ATV starts. The 3 of them get into the car and Paul teaches Joseph how to drive and explains how the pedals work. Once they are done, Thomas wants to go outside the boundaries again, but Paul asks him to go to the river and salvage wood with his brother, as they need to reinforce the window covers. Thomas protests that he wants to go to Rose Farm, but Paul says he can go tomorrow. They get in the car and head to the river for some wood. Thomas blames Joseph's bad driving for being stuck with him, as his dad asked him to supervise him while in his learning stage. Joseph says he doesn't need his help. Thomas gets an idea. He gets out of the ATV once they are out of their dad's sight. He tells Joseph they will meet later at this same spot, just before sunset, and return home together. Thomas runs through the woods again, passing over the same cave, and arrives at Rose Farm. He is greeted by Mr. Rose and his wife. He also runs into Charlotte, whom he secretly has a crush on. Paul fixes and reinforces the scratched door, while Joseph goes to the port in an abandoned ship and scavenges some wood. Thomas spends time with Charlotte, and they goof around and have fun. However, he spends too much time there and loses track of time. He promises to return, and she hugs him before leaving. Paul starts to worry as the sun starts to go down. The ATV is not starting, and Joseph fixes it by shifting the relays. Thomas runs through the woods to get back to the spot he agreed to meet Joseph at, but trips and falls into the cave and loses consciousness. Joseph arrives and waits at the spot for Thomas, but after seeing he isn't there, he returns to the house without Thomas. He informs his dad about Thomas going to Rose Farm. Paul tells Joseph to lock the house and goes out to find Thomas. Thomas wakes up in the cave as Paul and Rocco look for him. Thomas moves in the cave by using his magnesium lighter as a light source, and he comes across a weird creature. Paul hears the screeching of the creature. Thomas is on the ground and takes out a pocket knife to defend himself. He stabs the creature's hand and backs up, but another creature grabs his face. He struggles, and Paul arrives and saves him by stabbing the creature. Thomas tells his dad that he fell in by accident and hit his head. Paul makes his way to him. Paul hugs his son and asks if he is okay. He realizes they will have to spend the night there. He tells Thomas they will have to block the entrance. At home, Joseph does not lock the door properly. He falls asleep, sitting on the chair, and suddenly the door shakes and the cover of the giant peephole that is not locked opens. A creature puts his arm in the room, and even after extending, can't touch Joseph. It opens the door and stares at Joseph. As the creature gets in, Joseph traps it. It turns out he was awake, and it was his plan to catch the creature so he could study it. Back at the cave, the creatures block the exit, trap Paul and Thomas, and get to them by digging underground. Paul detonates some kind of explosive to fend off their attackers and injures himself heavily after the explosion. The next morning, Joseph arrives in the woods in the ATV. He finds Thomas and Paul and sees that they managed to survive, but Paul's arm is badly injured and he is unconscious. They put him in the ATV and took him home. Thomas goes into Joseph's room and sees the cage with a cloth over it. Joseph tells him how he caught the creature. Thomas bandages Paul, and the brothers talk about the creatures and how Thomas and Paul killed a bunch of them. And Thomas mentions he learned from Mr. and Mrs. Rose that the creatures don't go to the Rose farm anymore. They decide to go in the room and kill the trapped creature. Joseph takes the body to the barn and dissects it. Thomas arrives at the barn and says they should take Paul to Rose farm, as they have better medicine and facilities. Joseph believes they won't help and is against the idea but agrees to try. They put Paul in the ATV and take him to Rose farm. Thomas goes to talk to Mr. and Mrs. Rose, but they insist that they can't spare any medicine to help him and refuse to take in Paul. Charlotte advocates for them, but Mrs. Rose tells her to stop. She offers Thomas to stay with them and offers supplies for Joseph and Paul. Thomas and Joseph walk away. Joseph blames Thomas for Paul's condition. They fight, and Joseph leaves without Thomas. Thomas goes inside Rose farm, and Mr. Rose apologizes to him for his decision. Charlotte takes him inside and gives him food. He is not eating, but she encourages him to eat, and she then takes him to her room. They talk and start to kiss, and suddenly Mr. Rose walks in. He gets angry and tells Charlotte to go out. He also leaves. Joseph is driving back to his house, and he sees many sheep running around like crazy. He arrives home and sees strange marks on the ground. He takes his dad in the house, goes to the barn, and starts to check the ground, as he's afraid the creatures will dig under the house. At the Rose farm, Charlotte finds Thomas snooping around. He tells her he can't stay as his dad is injured, and asks Charlotte to give him the medicine. A man from Rose farm, Hobson, listens from outside. She gives him the medicine. He hugs her and gets out to leave, but Hobson holds him at gunpoint and asks him why he is stealing. Back at the house, Joseph is blocking windows and doors when suddenly he finds a tunnel in his house under a carpet. Back at Rose farm, Hobson takes Thomas to a barn where other men are also present. They tie him up while playing loud music, and Hobson points his shotgun at him. He is going to kill him, but before he can shoot, he is pulled underground by the creatures. The creatures have attacked Rose farm. Mr. Rose gets up and is about to go out when a creature ambushes him. He's holding a candle that falls and sets fire to the house. Mrs. Rose runs outside, but another creature attacks her. Charlotte comes out to check. She follows blood marks and sees a creature. In the barn, creatures attack the people, and Thomas manages to free himself. A creature comes in front of him, and Charlotte arrives in time and shoots the creature. Thomas sees that both houses are destroyed. He rushes to save Mr. and Mrs. Rose, but Charlotte tells him they are gone. Back at the house, Joseph blocks the creature's tunnel by dumping furniture and other stuff in it. He hears a voice from the door and goes to the cheek. Suddenly, the peephole cover slides open, but a human hand comes in. Thomas and Charlotte have arrived, and Joseph lets them in. Thomas gives him the medicine, and they bond again as brothers in arms. Their dad wakes up, and they give the medicine to him. Joseph tells him that creatures have dug under the house. Paul tells them to fight. They get some stuff from the barn and return to the house. Joseph tells Thomas to buy him time until he prepares something. Thomas and Charlotte get to work and start boarding the doors. Joseph collects furniture and other stuff and pours gasoline on it and uses a burning cigarette as a trigger. Thomas and Charlotte also get ambushed by creatures, and they manage to kill 2 of them. Joseph tells them he wants the creatures in the house. Meanwhile, Paul wakes up, comes to help, takes a bat and guards the door. He faces off against many creatures, while Joseph sets up a box as a bunker to avoid the explosion. A creature is about to overpower Paul when the brothers arrive and kill it. As they go to the room with the container box, Paul locks the door behind them and stays to face the creatures, so his sons have a better chance to survive. He has a flashback to the time when he held his sons 15 years ago. Joseph beats on the door and calls his dad, but Thomas tells him they have to go. They get in the box as a horde of creatures storms the room. Suddenly, an explosion occurs, destroying the house. The kids come out of the box and get in the ATV, which Thomas drives as Joseph instructs him. Some creatures that are burning but still alive chase them. After driving for a while, the creatures eventually die. After being rid of the creatures, they admire the starry sky. The next day when they return home, Thomas says they will rebuild it, but Joseph says instead of rebuilding, he wants to build something new. They bury their parents, and mourn them. When Thomas asks what they will do now, Joseph says they will look for other survivors. He tells Thomas to drive as the three of them get in the car and drive away as Rocco runs behind them. And that's all for today, guys. Here are another 2 amazing recap nest stories for you to binge on. See you next time.